I am 78 years old, and for the past 36 years I have been keeping a secret that would have destroyed everything I built. My career, my reputation, my freedom. I am a geologist, not a storyteller, not a conspiracy theorist, not someone who chases legends through the woods with a camera and a prayer. I spent 41 years reading the stories written in stone. I published papers in peer-reviewed journals. I consulted for the United States Geological Survey, for mining operations in 3 countries, for 2 universities in the Pacific Northwest. I deal in evidence. I deal in data. I deal in things I can hold in my hands and measure with instruments. And I am telling you now, with everything I have left, that what I found in the autumn of 1989 in a cave system in the northern Cascade Range of Washington State was real. The bones were real. The artifacts were real. And the DNA results that came back from 2 separate laboratories 18 years apart showed something that should not be possible. Something that rewrites everything we think we know about what lives in the forests of this continent. But that's not even the part that changed my life. The part that changed my life was the creature that led me to that cave, the creature I would come to know over the next 3 decades, the creature that is still alive today. My name is Harold Bryn. I was 42 years old when it started, and I have carried this weight every single day since. But before I tell you what I found in that cave, you need to understand why I was out there in the first place. Because everything that happened, every discovery, every impossible thing I witnessed, it all started with a death. Not the kind you're expecting, not something in the woods, something far worse. Something ordinary. In the summer of 1989, my wife Eleanor died of pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by July. 4 months, 19 years of marriage erased in 122 days. Eleanor was the only person in my life who made the silence feel comfortable. I am a quiet man, always have been. She understood that. She never tried to fill the space between us with noise. When she died, the silence didn't feel comfortable anymore. It felt like drowning. I couldn't stay in our house in Bellingham. Every room had her fingerprints on it. Not literally, but in the way the curtains were chosen, the way the bookshelves were arranged, the way the kitchen still smelled like the lemon cleaner she preferred. So I ran. I requested a solo field assignment from the USGS. They had been mapping geological formations in the northern Cascades, a remote section east of Mount Baker. Old logging roads had exposed rock faces that needed surveying. 6 months, September through February. A reinforced cabin at the end of a Forest Service road. The nearest town was Concrete, Washington, 40 miles south. I would drive in once every 2 weeks for supplies. The rest of the time I was alone. That was the point. The cabin sat at 3,200 feet, a narrow valley, Nooksack Creek feeding into unnamed tributaries. Old-growth Douglas fir and western red cedar so thick the canopy blocked out the sky. Noon felt like dusk. I had a propane generator, a radio that picked up one station on clear days, and a government-issued Toyota Land Cruiser that had seen better decades. My work was simple. Hike to exposed rock faces, take core samples, photograph stratification layers, catalog mineral deposits, methodical, solitary. Exactly what I needed. For 3 weeks I buried myself in it dawn to dark, pack heavy with samples, boots caked with mud. At night I would sit at the small table, transcribe my notes, eat canned soup, and fall asleep to rain on the tin roof. I did not think about Eleanor. I did not allow myself to. The earth was old enough and patient enough to hold my attention without asking anything of me in return. Then came October 14th, 1989, a Saturday. A cold, overcast Saturday, and everything changed. I was surveying a newly exposed rock face about 2 miles northeast of the cabin. A recent landslide had carved away a hillside and revealed a beautiful cross-section of Eocene-era volcanic deposits. I was photographing the layers when I noticed the mud below had been disturbed, not by the slide. The slide debris was settled, days old. These marks were fresh. I crouched down. Footprints, but not any footprint I had ever seen, canine in basic structure, 4 toes with visible claw impressions. But enormous. Each print measured roughly 9 inches long and 5 inches across. The stride between them was nearly 4 feet. And here is what made the hair on my arm stand up. Some of the prints showed 4 toes, others showed 5. I measured them 3 times, photographed them from multiple angles. A 4-toed canine track of that size would suggest a wolf of impossible proportions. But no wolf has 5 toes on its hind feet. Nothing I knew about the fauna of the Pacific Northwest could account for what I had just seen. I followed the tracks for a quarter mile before they disappeared into a creek bed, heading northeast, deeper into the wilderness. I made a note in my field journal. Anomalous canid tracks, unusual morphology, possible undocumented subspecies. I was a scientist. That was the language I used, but that night, lying in my bunk, I heard something that no amount of scientific language could explain. A vocalization, deep, resonant, somewhere between a howl and a groan, coming from the northeast. It lasted 4 seconds, stopped, then came again, longer, 7 seconds, and there was something in it that I can only describe as deliberate, not the mindless howl of a coyote, not the territorial call of a wolf. It had a cadence, a rhythm, as if the sound was structured. I stood at the window. The forest was black. The sound did not come again that night, but I would hear it again, many times, and what I would eventually learn about who was making that sound would keep me awake for the next 36 years. Over the next 2 weeks, I found more tracks, always in the same area, the northeast quadrant, within a 2-mile radius of the landslide site. The tracks varied in size, more than one animal. The largest prints measured 11 inches, the smallest about 7. I mapped them, noted locations, dates, sizes, direction of travel. A pattern emerged. These animals were moving between specific locations, a water source, a game trail along a ridgeline, and a convergence point, a steep hillside about 1.5 miles from my cabin. Dense undergrowth, tumbled boulders. I suspected a den site somewhere on that hillside. I did not approach it. Something in me, something older than my scientific training, told me not to. Not yet. November 2nd, 1989. Late afternoon, light already failing. I was crossing a small meadow between 2 ridges about 1 mile from the suspected den. I stepped out of the tree line and stopped. Across the meadow, 200 yards away, something was standing at the edge of the far tree line. My first thought was a bear, a large black bear on its hind legs. But bears don't stand the way this thing was standing. It was upright in a way that suggested it was built for it. Natural, balanced, the way a human stands. But it was not human. 7 feet tall, maybe 7.5, broad across the shoulders, much broader than any man. Dark fur, blackish brown. And the head was wrong. Not wrong like a deformity, wrong like it didn't belong on a body that stood like a man. Elongated, canine, pronounced muzzle, ears standing erect at the top of the skull. I was looking at something that had the body posture of a human and the head of a wolf. It did not move. It stood at the tree line and watched me. I could not see its eyes at that distance, but I felt them. The weight of its attention like a physical pressure on my chest. Then it turned, not quickly, not panicked, deliberately. The way a person turns when they've decided a conversation is over. And it walked into the trees on 2 legs. Its gait was smooth, fluid, slightly forward-leaning. Its arms swung at its sides. It disappeared into the shadows of the forest. and I stood in that meadow until the light was gone and the cold forced me to move. I want you to understand something about that moment. I was a man who had spent his entire adult life in the field. I had worked in remote areas on 4 continents. I had encountered grizzlies in Alaska, venomous snakes in the Appalachians, mountain lions on ridge trails in Colorado. I had never been afraid the way I was afraid in that meadow, because those animals, dangerous as they are, make sense. They fit inside the world I understood. What I was looking at across that meadow did not fit. It broke the frame. It was like finding a fossil in the wrong geological layer, something that shouldn't be there, something that tells you everything you thought you knew about the order of things was incomplete. I did not sleep that night. I searched every field guide, every reference book. There was no explanation. No known species of canid is bipedal. No known species of primate has a canine skull structure. I wrote one line in my personal journal, not my field journal, the private one. Saw it today. It is real. God help me, it is real. I underlined real twice. That journal is in a lockbox in my closet right now. The ink has not faded in 36 years, but here's what I haven't told you yet. What I found 19 days later would make that sighting look like nothing. Because on November 21st I found the cave. And what was inside that cave wasn't just evidence of a creature. It was evidence of something far more disturbing. Something that suggested these things had been watching us for a very, very long time. I was surveying the steep hillside where all the tracks converged, moving carefully through boulders and undergrowth. That's when I noticed it, a dark gap between 2 large basalt formations, about 4 feet wide, 3 feet tall, partially concealed by a fallen cedar. I would have walked past it if I hadn't been examining the basalt for mineral inclusions. But I stopped, because the ground in front of the gap was worn smooth, not weathered smooth the way rock becomes over centuries. Worn smooth the way a threshold becomes when it is crossed thousands of times. I set down my pack, took out my headlamp, got on my hands and knees. The gap opened into a wider passage, 5 feet high, 6 feet across, dry floor, good drainage. The air coming from inside was warm, noticeably warmer than November. That meant depth. I crawled through the entrance and stood up. My headlamp illuminated walls of dark basalt, smooth, ancient. The passage sloped gently downward, and the smell hit me. Musky, dense, organic. Wet fur and earth and something vaguely metallic. This was a den. The entrance was wrong for bears, too narrow relative to its height. The worn threshold suggested a creature that entered upright and ducked to get through. I should have turned around. Every rational part of my brain said leave. Come back with equipment, with colleagues, with someone who could verify what I was seeing. But Eleanor was dead. I had nothing waiting at the cabin except canned soup and silence, and the scientist in me would not let me walk away. I followed the passage 60 feet. The walls narrowed and then expanded again like a throat opening into a lung. The basalt was volcanic in origin, laid down millions of years ago, and I could read the layers even in the dim light of my headlamp. But this was not the time for geology. The passage opened into a chamber, roughly oval, 30 feet across, 15 feet high at the center. Sandy floor packed flat by use. My headlamp swept the space, and I felt my legs go weak. The chamber was not empty. It had not been empty for a very long time. There were bedding areas along one side, depressions in the sand lined with dried moss and cedar boughs, pressed flat and worn by heavy bodies. The smell was overwhelming in here. Layer upon layer of occupation, of living, of something making this space its home for years, maybe decades. But that's not what made my legs weak. What made my legs weak was along the far wall. Along the far wall, arranged with unmistakable deliberation, were objects. Human objects. A leather satchel, cracked and aged, consistent with early 20th century manufacture. A pocket watch, tarnished black, crystal shattered with an engraving on the back. To James, with all my heart, 1923. A hunting knife with a bone handle, its blade rusted to a thin wafer. Buttons, brass and bone, dozens of them arranged in a rough line. A pair of spectacles, one lens missing, wire frames bent but intact. And bones, not complete skeletons, not arranged anatomically, individual human bones placed alongside the artifacts with the same deliberate care. A femur, 2 tibias, a section of pelvis, several ribs, a mandible with 3 teeth still attached. Old, decades old, maybe longer. And here is the detail that matters most. They were not gnawed. They were not broken for marrow, they were placed. Gnawed bones tell you about predation. Placed bones tell you about something else entirely. I spent 2 hours in that chamber, photographing everything, measuring distances, sketching the layout. I did not touch anything. I could not bring myself to disturb the arrangement, because that's what it was, an arrangement. Not scattered, not piled, organized, grouped in clusters, each cluster containing both human artifacts and human remains, as if each cluster represented a person, as if whatever lived in this den had collected the belongings and bones of specific individuals and kept them together, maintained their association. I counted 7 distinct clusters, 7 people, or what remained of them, preserved underground by something that should not have had the capacity for such a thing. But I haven't told you about the marks on the wall, because the marks are what made me understand that this was not just a den. It was something else. Something I still don't have the right word for. On the wall above the artifact clusters at a height of about 6 feet, there were scratches. Deep, deliberate. Carved into the basalt with something harder than fingernail but not as precise as a tool. Claws. Each cluster had a set of marks above it. Some had 3 vertical lines, others had 4, one had 7. Tally marks. Something was counting. Something was marking the passage of time, or events or losses on the wall of its den above the remains of human beings it had collected and preserved. I stood there in the dim beam of my headlamp and felt the world shift beneath me. Not literally, though, as a geologist, I know what that feels like, too. When I finally crawled back out into the November air, the sun was setting. I sat on a boulder outside the entrance and I cried, not from fear, though I was afraid. I cried because I understood with the certainty of someone who reads evidence for a living, that I had just discovered something that would change everything. And I cried because I knew, with equal certainty, that I could never tell anyone. But that decision would be tested sooner than I expected. Because 3 days later, when I went back to collect samples, something followed me home. And what happened next forced me to make a choice that I have questioned every single day for 36 years. I returned to the cave on November 24th, this time with sample collection kits, sterile bags, labels, a battery-powered UV light. I collected 3 small bone fragments from the edges of the arrangement, pieces that had chipped off and were lying in the sand, not part of the deliberate placement. I sealed them in sterile bags. I also collected several hair samples embedded in the sandy floor, coarse, dark brown to black, 4 to 6 inches long, far too thick to be human. I sealed those as well, photographed the wall markings extensively. Then I left. That evening, hiking back to the cabin, I became aware that I was being followed. I did not hear footsteps, I did not see movement. But I felt it, the same oppressive weight of attention I had felt in the meadow, like eyes pressing into the back of my skull. Like the forest itself had become aware of me. I stopped on the trail. My heart was hammering. My mouth was dry. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I turned around slowly. It was there. 50 yards behind me, standing in the middle of the trail, tall, dark-furred, upright. That impossible canine head, but this time I was closer. This time I could see details that had been hidden by distance before. Its eyes were amber, deep golden amber that caught the last light and seemed to glow with an inner fire. Its fur was not uniform. Chest and belly lighter, grayish-brown, back and shoulders almost black. There was a ridge of darker fur running along its spine, standing slightly raised, not in aggression but in alertness, the way a dog's hackles lift when it is processing something unfamiliar. Its hands were enormous, long fingers, dark pads on palms and fingertips like leather, like the calloused hands of someone who has worked with them all their life. Thick curved claws, yellowish white, each one at least 3 inches long. It stood on the trail and looked at me. Not the way an animal looks at you, assessing threat, gauging distance, calculating whether to flee or fight. The way a person looks at you when they are deciding something, something important, something that cannot be undone. I could see the intelligence in those amber eyes, the consideration, the weighing of options. I raised my hands slowly, palms out. I said out loud, "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to tell anyone." My voice shook. My hands shook. Everything shook. The creature tilted its head slightly to the left, a gesture so precisely like a dog trying to understand a command that it would have been comical in any other context. It looked at me for about 30 seconds, then it turned and walked back up the trail into the trees, gone. I stood there until my legs stopped shaking. Then I walked back to the cabin, locked the door, pushed a chair against it for good measure, and did not go back to the northeast quadrant for 26 days. But I couldn't stop thinking about the samples, the bone fragments, the hair. I knew people. Contacts at the University of Washington, people who ran labs and owed me favors. If I could get those samples analyzed quietly, I might get answers. And the answers I got would change everything I thought I understood about what was living in those mountains. On December 18th, I drove to Concrete and used the payphone at the gas station. I called Dr. Richard Almeida, a forensic biologist at the University of Washington. I told him I had found unusual biological samples during fieldwork, asked if he could run analysis discreetly. Richard was a good man, curious. He agreed without pressing. I mailed the samples that afternoon, padded envelope, a note that read only, "Bone fragments and hair samples, unknown origin. Full DNA analysis requested, results to me personally. Please do not log these through official channels." I knew I was asking a lot, but Richard trusted me. I had never given him reason not to. 26 days I stayed away from those hills. The holidays passed in a blur of solitary work. I called my sister on Christmas Day, told her I was fine. The work was keeping me busy. She asked if I wanted to come home. I told her I couldn't leave the survey incomplete. What I didn't tell her was that I couldn't leave because of what was up in those hills. What I didn't tell her was that something up there had looked at me with amber eyes and decided, for reasons I could not fathom, not to kill me. January 5th, 1990. I went back. Not to the cave, to the meadow where I had first seen the creature. I sat on a fallen log at the tree line. I brought no camera, no collection kit, no instruments, just a thermos of coffee and a can of sardines. I opened the sardines and set them on the ground about 20 feet in front of me. An offering. I didn't know the protocol for introducing yourself to something that shouldn't exist. Food seemed reasonable. I sat there for 4 hours, nothing came. The sardines froze. I went back to the cabin. I returned the next day, and the next, and the next. On the 4th day, January 8th, the sardines from the previous day were gone. Not the can. The can was exactly where I had placed it, but the fish had been picked out carefully without disturbing its position. I opened a new can, sat on my log, waited. At about 3 in the afternoon, with snow beginning to fall, I saw movement at the far tree line, amber eyes, dark fur. It stood in the shadows and watched me. I did not move, did not speak, let it watch. After 10 minutes, it stepped forward, out of the tree line, into the open meadow, walking toward the sardine can with a gait that was both fluid and cautious. Weight forward, head slightly lowered, eyes never leaving me. It stopped 15 feet from the can, still 35 feet from me. It crouched, a motion disturbingly graceful for its size, reached out one enormous clawed hand and picked up the can. It ate the fish one at a time, using its fingers, not its mouth, to extract them from the tin. Then it set the can down, exactly where it had been. Stood up, looked at me, I looked at it, snow fell between us. That was the beginning. And I need to pause here and tell you something about trust. About what it actually looks like when it's built from nothing between two beings who have no common language, no shared frame of reference, no reason to believe the other means no harm. It does not happen in a moment. It does not happen in a week. It happens in small, painful increments. One gesture at a time, one risk at a time, one morning of sitting in the cold and getting nothing in return at a time. It is the slowest, most fragile thing I have ever been part of. Over the next 3 months, through the rest of that winter into spring of 1990, I returned to the meadow almost every day. Sardines, then canned tuna, then dried salmon from a market in concrete. The creature came more frequently, came closer each time. By February, it ate within 20 feet of me. By March, it would sit on the ground across from me, long legs folded beneath it, eating while I drank my coffee. I began to talk to it. Not because I expected it to understand, because the silence between us was becoming something I wanted to fill. I told it about Eleanor, about my work, about the rock formations I was mapping, about the deep time written in stone, about my childhood in Montana, my father, the rancher, the mountains I grew up under. The creature listened. I know how that sounds, but it did. The head tilt. The amber eyes fixed on my face with an attention more focused and patient than any human listener I have ever known. Sometimes it made a sound, a low rumble deep in its chest. Not a growl, something softer, a hum. I came to understand that this was acknowledgement. It was telling me it heard me. But I was still waiting for the DNA results. And when they finally arrived, they didn't just confirm what I had seen with my own eyes. They revealed something far more profound. Something that meant these creatures weren't just unknown animals. They were something much closer to us than anyone could have imagined. Something that had been hiding in plain sight, in the deepest forests, for thousands of years. And the proof was written in their genes. Late March, the snow was beginning to melt. My survey was winding down. A letter from Dr. Almeida arrived at the concrete post office. I opened it in the cab of my truck, read it twice, then a third time. The bone fragments were human, old, 70 to 100 years based on degradation, definitely Homo sapiens. The hair samples were not. The DNA analysis returned results Richard described as confounding. Mitochondrial DNA showed markers consistent with canidae, wolves, dogs, foxes. But the nuclear DNA contained sequences that were anomalous, showing homologous regions with Homo sapiens at a frequency that far exceeds any known interspecific similarity. In plain language, the hair belonged to something that was genetically part canid and part human. Not a hybrid the way we understand hybridization. Not a mix of two species. Something else. Something that shared deep ancestral genetic material with both lineages. As if somewhere in the ancient past, the evolutionary paths that led to canids and the paths that led to humans had a common branch that we never knew existed. A branch that didn't die out. A branch that kept evolving, separately. In the shadows, Richard ended his letter with one question. "Harold, where did you get these samples?" I never answered. The DNA changed everything. Not because it told me what the creature was, it didn't. Not really. It told me what it wasn't. It wasn't simply an unknown animal. It wasn't a freak of nature. It was something that shared a piece of our own genetic heritage. Something that had been walking alongside humanity, in the dark, in the deep forests, for longer than we could imagine. Those bones in the cave, those human remains arranged with such care, they weren't trophies, they weren't the remnants of meals, they were memorials, remembrances, the tally marks on the wall, the clusters of artifacts kept together, each person's belongings preserved with their bones. These creatures had been watching us for a very long time, and some of us, the ones who wandered too far, the ones who stumbled onto their existence, had been taken in. Not as prey, as something else. And when those people died, the creatures mourned them. They kept their things. They marked their walls. They remembered. My assignment officially ended in February of 1990. I negotiated an extension through April, cited the complexity of the formations. But I was not ready to leave. The creature I had come to think of as the Watcher had begun to bring me things. A smooth river stone, pale gray with a vein of quartz, placed on the log where I usually sat before I arrived one morning. I recognized the gesture, corvid behavior, crows bringing gifts to humans who feed them. But this was not a crow. This was a 7.5-foot bipedal canid with intelligence I was only beginning to comprehend. I brought the stone back the next day, placed it between us. The Watcher looked at it, then at me, made a sound I hadn't heard before, a short, soft bark that almost sounded like laughter. It picked up the stone and placed it closer to me. I picked it up and held it. First gift exchange. The gifts became more complex, a section of antler polished smooth, a perfect spherical stone, a natural concretion, rare and beautiful. And once, a small bone, a human finger bone, old and brown, placed carefully on the log. I held it in my palm and looked at the Watcher. Its amber eyes held mine with an expression I can only describe as solemnity. It was sharing something with me, including me. I put the bone in my pocket and carried it for 17 years before I placed it back in the cave. I did not leave that valley in April of 1990. I purchased 12 acres adjacent to the national forest boundary. Money Eleanor and I had saved for a retirement we would never share. The land included a hunting shack built in the 60s by a logger, abandoned in the 70s. I spent the summer making it habitable. Propane line, wood stove, improved the road. I told the USGS I was taking extended leave, told my sister I was working on a private research project. Neither was entirely a lie. I was researching, gathering data, doing the most important scientific work of my life, and I could tell absolutely no one. Over the next 5 years, something extraordinary happened. By 1993, the Watcher would come to my cabin, sit on the porch in the evenings, 20 feet from my chair. We would watch the sun go down together. I would sit with my coffee and the Watcher would sit with its legs folded, that enormous body somehow compact and still, and the only sound was the creak and the wind and the occasional low hum from its chest that I had come to understand meant peace. There were evenings when I would talk for an hour straight, about Eleanor, about the life I had left behind, about how strange it was that the greatest friendship of my life was with a being I could not name, could not explain, could not tell anyone about. The Watcher never interrupted. It never looked away. It gave me its full attention in a way that no human being ever had, because humans are always thinking about what they're going to say next. The Watcher had no words to plan. It simply listened. And in that listening, in that absolute, patient, unwavering presence, I found something I had not felt since Eleanor was alive. I felt known. By 1994, it had brought me to meet others. 6 in the group, 4 adults, 2 younger ones, smaller, maybe 5 feet tall. I was careful never to look at the younger ones directly for too long. I sensed this made the adults uncomfortable. The group had a hierarchy. The watcher was not the leader. The leader was massive, easily 8 feet, grizzled muzzle, a scar running from its left eye to the corner of its jaw. Healed years ago, but still visible as a pale line through dark fur. I called this one the Elder. The Elder watched me with the same amber eyes as the rest. But there was something additional in its gaze, a weight of years and decisions that I recognized. I had seen the same thing in the eyes of old men who had lived through wars. By 1995, I could identify each member by sight. The Watcher, the Elder, the singer who made the most complex vocalizations. The Shadow, the most elusive, almost never letting me see it fully. And the pair, 2 young ones always together. I documented everything, filled journals, took photographs when I could, though the creatures were remarkably adept at avoiding the camera. In 20 years, I got perhaps 30 clear photographs. Even those show figures partially obscured by trees, by shadow, by distance. Everything stored in my lockbox. I told no one. The years between 1995 and 2010 were the richest of my life. I know what those years would have looked like from the outside. A lonely man in a shack, talking to himself, losing his grip. My sister called less often. Colleagues assumed I had broken down after Eleanor's death. A few reached out over the years. Letters, conference invitations, collaboration offers. I let them all go. The life I had built in academia, the reputation, the publications, the professional network. I watched it dissolve like snow in a spring creek. And I did not care, because what I had found was worth more than every paper I had ever published combined, worth more than tenure, worth more than recognition. The single greatest scientific discovery of the century. And I was the only person alive who knew. And I would take it to my grave before I let anyone turn those creatures into specimens. I learned their vocalizations the way you learn a language, not individual words, the shape and feeling. The low hum meant acknowledgement, peace. The sharp bark was a warning. Not to me specifically, a general alert. The long layered howl I first heard in October of 1989 was more complex, communication across distance, carrying information. I couldn't decode it fully, but I could tell by the responses whether the message was urgent, routine, or emotional. There was also silence. Pointed silence after a vocalization was a question. Long silence in company was comfort. Abrupt silence was alarm. I wrote all of this down. By 2005, I had 17 journals. The cave remained central. I developed a routine for visiting. Approach slowly, make noise, scuff boots on rock, hum old songs Eleanor had liked, let whatever was listening know it was me. I never entered without the watcher present. There was one occasion in the spring of 1998 when I approached alone. Before I had taken 3 steps, the shadow materialized from behind a boulder, blocked my path, did not growl, did not bare its teeth, just stood there. 8 feet of dark fur and absolute stillness, looking at me the way a security guard looks at someone in the wrong hallway. I backed away, raised my palms, sat on a rock 50 yards from the entrance. 20 minutes later, the watcher appeared. Whatever silent negotiation took place resulted in the shadow stepping aside. I never tested the boundary again. The 7 clusters from 1989 became 9 by 2003. 2 new additions, each with human artifacts and bone fragments, each marked with fresh scratches on the wall. I did not know where these remains came from. I told myself they were people who died in the wilderness, lost hikers, hunters who succumbed to the elements. The creatures found them and brought them here. That was easier than the alternatives, but the artifacts in the newer clusters were more recent. A digital watch, hiking boots with Vibram soles, a wallet containing a Washington state driver's license issued in 1997. I did not take the wallet, did not look at the name. I was afraid of what knowing would mean, what it would require of me. I chose to believe in the kindest explanation, that these creatures collected the dead with reverence, that the cave was not a larder but a cathedral. I still believe that. I have to. In 2008, I sent a second set of samples to a different lab, through a former student at Stanford. I told her they were from a canid species I had encountered during fieldwork. I was meticulous about collection. Fresh hair samples from a bedding area the watcher used, a sheltered depression between two boulders near the cave entrance, hairs caught on rough basalt where the creature rubbed its back, collected with tweezers into sterile vials. Nitrile gloves, every protocol followed. I also collected a shed claw, 4 inches long, curved like a raptor's talon, layers of keratin visible when held to light, dense, dark, unlike any known species. The results came back 4 months later. They confirmed what Richard Almeida found 19 years earlier, but with far greater precision. The nuclear genome showed a mosaic pattern unlike anything in existing databases. 62% Canidae, closest alignment with the genus Canis. Wolves, but 31% showed homology with primate genomes, and of that 31%, nearly half aligned specifically with Homo sapiens. The remaining 7% matched nothing in any database on Earth. The researcher at Stanford flagged it as contamination, recommended rerunning. I told her not to bother. I had collected them myself, with sterile equipment, from a cave no other human had entered. What the DNA was telling me, what it had been telling me since 1990, was that these creatures were not simply animals that happened to walk upright. They shared a deep, ancient connection with us. At the genetic level, they were family, in the most literal biological sense. A branch of the family tree we had forgotten, or that had chosen to be forgotten. By 2015, I was 70 years old and feeling it, knees aching on the hikes, vision not what it had been. Winters harder. The trail to the meadow that I used to walk in 40 minutes now took me an hour. Some mornings I would stand at the cabin door and look at the tree line, and wonder if today was the day my body would finally refuse to make the trip. I had arthritis in both hands, the same hands that had collected thousands of rock samples, that had written 17 journals, that had held a pocket watch engraved to a man named James who had walked into these mountains 100 years ago and never walked out. But the creatures were aging too. The elder had slowed noticeably, muzzle almost entirely gray, moving with a stiffness I recognized from my own body. It would sit for long periods in the sun in a clearing near the cave entrance, its massive frame still and quiet, eyes half closed, breathing slowly. I understood that posture. It was the posture of something conserving what it had left. The watcher, my watcher, the one I had first seen across the meadow in 1989, was showing age. Fur lightened, black fading to dusty brown, more time sitting than standing. Its amber eyes, once so bright they seemed to carry their own light, had dulled to a softer gold. We had grown old together, in a valley no one else knew about, sharing a silence that held more meaning than any conversation I had ever had with another human being. There is something profound about aging alongside another being, something that strips away everything that doesn't matter and leaves only the essential truth of two lives lived in parallel. The pair had grown into adults, 3 new young ones, small, quick, curious. The group had grown to 9, life continuing, time doing what time does. The elder died in the winter of 2017. I did not witness it, but I found the aftermath, a new cluster in the cave, the 10th. But different from the others, no human artifacts, no human bones, instead objects from the forest, stones, feathers, a section of cedar bark, the skull of a deer. And above this cluster, on the wall, not tally marks but something else, a series of marks more complex than anything I had seen before. Covering a section nearly 3 feet wide, I could not interpret them, but I could feel their weight. Whatever those marks meant, they carried the accumulated meaning of a life lived across decades, maybe centuries, in these mountains. The watcher was there when I found it, sitting beside the cluster. Amber eyes dim, massive body curled in on itself, a posture I had never seen before, diminished, inward, the posture of something that had lost a part of itself it could not get back. I recognized it because I had held that same posture in a hospital room in Bellingham in July of 1989, sitting beside Eleanor's bed after the monitors went flat. I sat down beside the watcher, close, closer than I had ever been. I could feel the warmth of its fur against my arm. It did not move away. We sat together for a long time, in the dark of the cave, surrounded by the dead, by the memorials, by the tally marks and the artifacts and the bones of people whose names no one would ever know. And I understood that grief is not a human invention. It is something older than us, something we share with beings we have never had the courage to acknowledge. I put my hand on the watcher's arm. Its fur was coarse under my palm, warm, alive. It made a sound I had never heard before, low, broken, a sound that came from somewhere deeper than the chest. I held on to it, and we grieved together, for the elder, for Eleanor, for every loss that had brought us to this moment, sitting side by side in the dark, 2 species that should never have met and could never be separated again. I am 78 years old now. It is 2025. I am sitting in the cabin I have lived in for 35 years. The cabin bought with money Eleanor and I saved, 12 acres from a cave that contains the remains of at least 10 individuals, human and otherwise, and a genetic secret that would rewrite every textbook on this planet. The watcher is still alive, though barely. It comes to my porch once or twice a week now. Instead of every evening, when it does, it sits closer than it ever has. So close I can feel the heat of its body, smell the deep, musky scent of its fur. A scent I once found terrifying and now find as comforting as wood smoke. Sometimes it reaches out, places its enormous hand on my knee, and we sit together, 2 old creatures watching the light change through the trees. I think about what happens when I am gone, every day. The lockboxes will go to my niece in Missoula. She has never asked why I live alone in the woods. I have written her a letter, sealed inside the first lockbox, explaining everything, the journals, the photographs, the DNA results, the pocket watch engraved to James. I have asked her to read the letter first, to decide for herself what to do with what she finds. No instructions beyond that. Either the truth finds its way into the world, or it doesn't. I have done my part. I have borne witness. 3 lockboxes, 17 journals, 30 photographs, 2 sets of DNA results from 2 separate laboratories 18 years apart. A pocket watch engraved to James with all my heart, 1923. A shed claw 4 inches long, and a small smooth stone with a vein of quartz running through it. The first gift I ever received from something that science says cannot exist. I am telling you this because I am running out of time, and because the truth deserves to outlive me, even if it can never be proven the way the world demands proof. What lives in those mountains is not a monster. It is not a myth. It is a relative we forgot. The DNA proves it. The bones prove it. The 36 years I spent sitting on a porch with one of them proves it. I lost my wife in 1989. I thought that was the end of everything. Instead, it was the beginning of a relationship that taught me more about connection, about patience, about what it means to truly know another being than any human relationship I had ever had. I do not say that to diminish what Eleanor and I shared. I say it because what I found in that valley showed me that love is not limited to our species, that grief is not limited to our species, that the desire to remember the dead, to preserve their belongings, to mark the walls of a cave so that someone someday might understand what was lost, that is not limited to our species either. I am a geologist. I read the stories written in stone, and I am telling you that the oldest story, the one written in the genes of a creature that walks like a man and howls like a wolf, is the story of a family that was separated so long ago that both sides forgot the other existed. Until one autumn day in 1989, in a valley in the northern Cascades, when a grieving man and a creature with amber eyes looked at each other across a meadow and remembered.